Easter Island? Or maybe the last paradise on Earth? How do giant stone heads pull off a rock and roll dance? Ever tried fishing with a kite? Can a rock knock you out like anesthesia? Want a tattoo made with a fish? Or land a job by letting someone else take the fall? We'll tell you about an extraordinary civilization and how it was destroyed by humans and rats. That's right, man-made disaster, cannibalism, and deadly epidemics. An island that thrived in total isolation, far from the rest of the world. Its people gave us the breathtaking Moai statues, known across the globe. But how on earth did they build them? And what do we really know about the creators of these massive stone giants? A violent storm. 3 heavily armed Dutch warships are tossed around by the raging waves of the Pacific. The sailors, clinging to the rails, curse witches for conjuring the tempest, or blame the devil of the sea himself. Some dream of turning back, but Admiral Jacob Roggeveen holds his course into the unknown, convinced the legendary southern continent is about to appear on the horizon. So what was this southern continent? People believed it lay deep in the southern hemisphere, a kind of counterweight to Asia and Europe. Many dreamed of reaching it, but the seas were far from peaceful. In the late 17th century, the great naval powers split into 2 fierce coalitions: France, England, Sweden, Cologne, and Munster on one side, the Dutch, the era's top sea power, along with Spain, the Habsburgs, and Brandenburg on the other. Everyone was competing fiercely to prove who controlled the seas. The discovery of new trade routes, vast lands, and valuable colonies sparked bitter territorial disputes between the powers. These tensions soon escalated into open war. The sudden influx of wealth from overseas territories only fueled the monarchs' greed even more. They wanted more. At that very moment, while all resources were thrown into the flames of war, an adventurer showed up at the doors of the Dutch West India Company. The company, which held a monopoly on trade and colonization, was also known for a few other things, like selling slaves and robbing Spanish ships. But hey, that was just part of the business model. Back then, adventurers were a dime a dozen, and here came another one, armed with a bold plan that promised mountains of gold. All they had to do was send out an expedition and discover a brand new continent. The idea caught the company's attention. It sounded tempting, but outfitting a journey like that in wartime? Nearly impossible. So the plan was shelved and nearly forgotten, until 40 years later, an experimented sailor showed up with the exact same idea. Admiral Jacob Roggeveen, the son of that same adventurer, and this time, the company said yes. Roggeveen got 3 sturdy warships and a crew of 223 brave sailors and soldiers. In August of 1721, they set out to sea. For 9 long months, they crossed the vast ocean, endlessly searching for new lands. Then, in April of 1722, a lookout suddenly shouted from the mast, "Land ho!" An island appeared on the horizon. It felt almost like magic, as if a dream had come to life right before their eyes. And it just so happened to be Easter Sunday, a day full of meaning and hope. To honor this extraordinary and memorable moment, Roggeveen decided to name the newly discovered land Easter Island. For the crew, it was more than a mere coincidence. The islanders eagerly gathered on the shore. They called their land Rapa Nui. Imagine what was going through their minds. They watched the strangers with quiet curiosity, trying to understand exactly who had arrived. What they saw was a new world, European civilization. That moment sealed their fate. So what was happening on board? When they saw the crowd of islanders, the Europeans did what they usually did back then. They fired. A shot rang out, and one of the islanders dropped dead. The islanders had never encountered guns before. Horrified, they ran, but not for long. Soon they returned, trembling yet determined to face the strangers again. Then the admiral ordered a second round of fire. This time, around 10 were killed. Lost in fear and confusion, the islanders placed everything they owned at the feet of the Dutch. Gifts, tools, offerings, anything to make it stop. Roggeveen saw this as surrender and led his men ashore to explore the mysterious island. The admiral called it a paradise on earth. He was amazed by the lush gardens the islanders had cultivated at the foot of the volcano, by their way of life, and of course, by the giant Moai. Later he wrote,
"The locals lit fires in front of towering stone statues that left us in awe. We couldn't begin to understand how these people, without timber, tools, or strong ropes, had managed to raise such massive figures. The statues were draped in long flowing strips of cloth that hung from their shoulders all the way down to the base, and on their heads sat woven baskets, carefully filled with smooth white stones.
The Dutch saw the sacred Moai as they once were, majestic and undisturbed. No other Europeans would witness them in such glory again. But that's a story for a bit later. For now, on the most isolated island on the planet, the Rapa Nui, which considered itself the only one on Earth, still lived by their ancient ways, but that world was soon about to end. Let's take a step back and try to see their life through the mists of time. We'll begin with how they looked. Picture a Rapa Nui islander, bright red from head to toe, his hair and skin dyed with red pigment. The Europeans at first believed it was their real skin color, a mark of their race. On top of that, their bodies were covered in blue or dark green tattoos, and some even added white pigment over it all, like war paint. Men usually had more tattoos than women. The ladies mostly inked their thighs and faces, and the older you got, the more tattoos you had, because they weren't just for looks. They were not just badges of honor, but also powerful talismans. Getting one wasn't easy though. The local tattoo parlors were brutal. Artists crushed burned plant leaves into powder and pushed it into the skin using, tiny fish bones. Don't even think about trying this yourself. Go see a pro. Actually, the Rapa Nui really cared about their looks. They kept an eye on their weight and sometimes went on intense fasts. European explorers even wrote about the women's unique hairstyles. They tied their hair back and wore tiny boat-shaped hats made of reed. Their ears sparkled with oversized earrings, real fashionistas of their time. Their religion remains a mystery, but we do know of the Birdman cult, Tangata Tapumanu. To earn the title of Birdman was a true and difficult challenge. Each year, they held a ritual contest that rivaled the Olympics in intensity. There were several teams, each made up of 2 brave guys. The one who hoped to become the sacred Birdman had to stay behind on the main island, waiting. His teammate, risking his life, had to swim nearly 2 kilometers to the islet of Motunui, where the seabirds nested on steep cliffs. The goal? To get the very first egg of the season. Some were eaten by sharks, others drowned, and a few fell to their death. The first to grab the precious egg quickly climbed to the island's highest point and loudly shouted down to his waiting partner, "Shave your head! We've got the egg!" The rest had to turn back, empty-handed. The winner, however, remained behind on the island, fasting with the egg, his sacred treasure. And after all that, barely alive, he swam back to his home island with the egg balanced in a basket on his head. But he still had to climb a steep cliff. If he didn't fall, he'd deliver the egg to his partner, who was already waiting with a shaved head, painted either red or white. And it was this partner, not the swimmer, who would be named Tangata Tapumanu. The new birdman then went into seclusion for a year, living in a special house or cave, wearing traditional regalia and abstaining from all duties, focusing solely on embodying the spirit of the birdman. There's barely any reliable info about the ceremonies that were later held on the island. But one thing does stand out, a repeated theme in their cave art, drawings of women's genitals. Researchers spent ages trying to crack the code, and in the end, their best guess was that these symbols appeared during coming-of-age rites for girls. Fine, we'll go with that theory. In any case, Rapa Nui women weren't exactly conventional either. Just take their approach to childbirth. That alone could make your jaw drop. The woman would squat on the ground, while her husband pressed down on her belly to help the baby out. And their idea of pain relief was quite unusual. Get this, a rock, just a simple rock carefully wrapped in reeds. They'd lay it in front of the woman, believing it somehow eased the pain. But that's not even the most shocking part. They didn't cut the umbilical cord. No scissors, no knives. The father would bite it off. Yes, actually bite through it with his teeth. After that, a priest would tie the cord. That was a sacred moment, when he was believed to pass his life-giving power to the child. They also practiced this ritual, placing hot, smooth stones on the woman's belly to prevent folds. Spoiler warning, it didn't really work. By the way, they could just hand the baby over to their friends. The child was renamed and raised as family, making Rapa Nui genealogy hard to trace. By the way, the bird cult wasn't just about rituals or eggs, it shaped daily life, including fishing. Watching sooty terns dive, The Rapa Nui made kites from twigs and tapa cloth painted like birds. They tied baited hooks to the kite strings and launched them from canoes. The goal was to trick the fish into thinking a harmless bird was floating above, so they wouldn't be frightened by the shadow of the boat. This ingenious method helped them catch fish more effectively and shows how deeply their bird cult shaped their everyday survival techniques. Clever, right? And they loved challenges. Besides stealing eggs from cliffs, they surfed on reed boards centuries ago. They also held sports competitions. Though the rules are lost, knowing their creativity, those games were probably as intense as everything else they did. Truly remarkable people. Overall, they were known for being peaceful and easygoing. After all, who would you even fight on a tiny island in the middle of the ocean? But humans always find a reason, and so did the people of Easter Island. They split into 10 tribes, which eventually formed 2 rival factions. That rivalry lasted for generations, each with its own leaders and ongoing rivalries. The Moai were made to honor each clan's ancestors. That's why every statue looks unique. The Rapa Nui even gave their stone giants tattoos. Carved into their backs were suns, rainbows, rain, birds, and vulvas. Each one had its own sacred set. The carving began back in the 13th century. Locals believed that the Moai held the sacred supernatural power of their forefathers, a power that ensured fertility and abundance. They placed these giant statues on raised stone platforms to show their spiritual importance as messengers between humans and the gods. Most of them, towering between 3 and 9 meters tall and weighing anywhere from 5 to 10 tons, stand with their backs to the sea, watching over their people silently. The Moai didn't always have such lifeless eyes. Back in the day, people inserted pieces of coral into the sockets. They were carved on the slopes of the long-dead Rano volcano, straight out of volcanic tuff. To this day, you can still find lots of unfinished statues there. Not all of them reached their final spots. Some are still lying scattered across the island. And check this out. People used to think they were just heads sticking out of the ground. But no, they actually have full bodies. There's also one unique statue on the island. It's made from red pumice instead of tuff, and it's the only one kneeling. They say it's a singer. Some of the Moai wear hats painted in red, the islanders' favorite color. It's believed they'd place the statue first, then put the hat on top. But as for why some have them and others don't, that's still an unsolved mystery that puzzles researchers to this day. One of the island's biggest and most enduring mysteries is how the Rapa Nui, without using carts, animals, or cranes, managed to move those enormous Moai statues from the quarries all across the island. So what were the options? Dragging them by force? That would have been insanely hard. Rolling them like logs? Not a great idea. You'd risk breaking parts like their noses or lips. Maybe they used wooden sleds or wheels? Also unlikely. There wasn't enough wood left on the island. For many years, scientists were baffled, until they finally decided to ask the islanders themselves. And the answer they got? The Moai actually walked. Sounds like a legend, right? But the scientists took it seriously. They ran a test, and it turns out this method could actually work quite well. See for yourself. Researchers tested a theory. Due to the Moai's big bellies and their forward-shifted center of gravity, the statues could walk upright if rocked from side to side. This unusual technique even got a name: rock and roll. Another theory suggests the Moai were hauled across the island using wooden sleds. These two remain the most widely accepted explanations, but scientists still don't know for sure which one the Rapa Nui actually used. The Moai, once revered as sacred guardians and spiritual protectors, now look completely different. It was the Rapa Nui people themselves who ultimately destroyed their majestic presence after losing faith in the power and magic of the stone figures. But what exactly caused such anger among the Rapa Nui? The truth is, they had been plagued by hardships for a long time. When Roggeveen's expedition finally reached the island in the early 18th century, there were about 3,000 people living there. But archaeological studies later revealed that just a century earlier, the population was actually closer to 15,000. And when the first settlers, possibly from Polynesia or even South America, arrived around the year 1200, the island had been lush with forests. As they began settling this new land, they used the forest in every way, with no restraint. Trees were chopped down to make room for agriculture. They grew bananas, sweet potatoes, taro, yams, and sugarcane. Wood was burnt for cooking, carved into boats, and used in daily life. But the trouble didn't end there. Polynesian rats, accidentally brought on their boats, spread quickly across the island. Interestingly, the islanders considered them a delicacy and even ate them. But the rats ate tree seeds faster than the forest could recover. As the trees disappeared one by one, the island's wildlife began to fade away too. Later on, the islanders made efforts to bring back their ecosystem. They even planted young palm trees, but it was already too late. Erosion had begun in earnest, and the soil could no longer retain moisture. The ecological crisis looming over Rapa Nui began to affect their daily lives and the mood of the entire society. Even though the ocean's riches were just a step away, they didn't help much. Fishing was a challenge. The island had no reefs where fish usually thrive, so people had to sail far out into the ocean. But with so little wood left to build proper boats, seaworthy vessels were increasingly scarce. Hunger was closing in, and as the hunger crept closer, things only continued to get worse. People started eating each other, literally eating one another to survive. And because of how tangled and confusing the family trees were, it often meant they ended up eating their own blood relatives. During times of famine, birth rates dropped sharply. The island's population shrank nearly fivefold. In a strange way, this reduction in numbers helped them temporarily. Fewer mouths to feed meant more resources per person. But their suffering wasn't over. The New World dealt another devastating blow. In 1862, 8 ships from Peru arrived at the island. The Peruvians were looking for laborers, but in truth they were hunting for slaves to sell in the markets. They ended up capturing between 1,000 and 2,000 islanders, taking them to the mainland and selling them into slavery. Almost all of them died, either from brutal working conditions or from diseases they had no immunity against. Only about 100 survived. Eventually, after mounting pressure, the governments of France and Tahiti stepped in. Following weeks of deliberations and political back and forth, the European powers finally declared the slave trade of Easter Islanders illegal. They demanded that every single Rapa Nui captive be brought back home. But by then, it was too late. Only 15 of them were still alive to return. The fact that anyone remembered them at all, that their rights were defended, could have been seen as a miracle, a rare story with a happy ending. But the Europeans overlooked one crucial and devastating thing, and that mistake ultimately pushed the civilization to the brink of extinction. The people who were brought back to the island carried deadly smallpox. An epidemic spread. Death swept through the island. What followed was a devastating spiritual collapse that ignited a fierce religious uprising. The islanders turned against the Moai and began tearing them down. Many of the priests who guarded the ancient island's secrets perished during this time. The Rapa Nui left behind a written language, but it can't tell us anything. It's a system of glyphs known as rongorongo. It resembles the writing of ancient China, Egypt, and Crete. But scientists haven't been able to decode it yet. There's simply too little data. The same goes for the writing of ancient Crete. If you haven't watched the episode yet, check it out via the link. Some scientists believe that the Rapa Nui script might never be fully deciphered. They weren't the only civilization to vanish after coming face to face with the so-called enlightened world of Europe. If it weren't for the Moai, we probably wouldn't be so eager to piece together the fragments of their story, just like the traditions of certain tribes in Africa or South America, now remembered only by a handful of experts. And yet, somehow, unfair to simply admire these towering monuments without truly seeing and understanding the people who crafted them. The large, imposing shadows cast by the Moai across this sun-drenched island have buried an entire ancient civilization that lost its faith in the gods. Admiral Roggeveen continued traveling the ocean for about 3 more years. During that time, he discovered several islands, but none were as remarkable as Easter Island. His discovery earned him a place in history. Although he wasn't the first to find the island, he was the first to land on it and document it. Roggeveen died in poverty and likely spent his final days quietly reflecting on the paradise on Earth he had uncovered in the Pacific. What does paradise on Earth really look like to you? Tell us in the comments!